America is breaking in ways the numbers were never supposed to show. 42 million people, 1 in every 8 Americans, rely on food assistance just to eat. Grocery prices are up 8 to 12%, but real food bills are up 40 to 80% for working families. 1 in 4 households is now financing groceries with credit. Utility bills are jumping $400 in a single month, rents are up 50%, and wages barely moved. When people start planning grocery thefts before Thanksgiving, that's not crime, it's collapse. This isn't inflation. This is a system failing to feed its own people. The collapse begins where most Americans never look. Food access, not wages, not housing, not jobs. Food. SNAP feeds roughly 42 million people every month, nearly 13% of the US population. That includes full-time workers, seniors, veterans, people with disabilities, and children. This is not a fringe safety net. It is a core pillar holding up the consumer economy. When that pillar weakens, instability spreads immediately and predictably. SNAP is not discretionary spending. It functions as scheduled income for households living within razor-thin margins. Benefits are budgeted weeks in advance, layered into rent payments, utility timing, transportation costs, and debt minimums. When funding is delayed or interrupted, the impact is not gradual. It is instant. Food disappears overnight while bills remain fixed. That mismatch is where panic enters the system. Government shutdown mechanics make this worse. SNAP funding relies on appropriation cycles, not automatic stabilization. When political gridlock freezes funding, households don't receive partial relief or temporary substitutes. They receive nothing. Tens of millions of people are suddenly expected to absorb a $150 to $300 monthly food gap per household with no buffer. For families already spending 30 to 40% of income on housing, there is no place to pull that money from without consequences. The scale matters. SNAP distributes over $110 billion annually into grocery stores, wholesalers, logistics networks, and local economies. When that flow stalls, retailers don't just lose revenue, inventory patterns break. Demand becomes unpredictable. Security costs rise, shrinkage increases, food deserts expand. What looks like a benefits issue becomes a supply chain stress event at the retail level within days. This is where behavior changes. Not because people suddenly act irrationally, but because scarcity forces coordination. When millions lose food access simultaneously, individual desperation becomes collective pressure. Retail systems are not designed for that kind of synchronized stress. They are optimized for steady demand, not survival surges. Once those systems strain, the consequences spill outward into public safety, pricing, and access for everyone, not just SNAP recipients. The deeper failure is political design. Shutdowns do not harm lawmakers. They do not pause asset markets. They do not interrupt capital flows. They target consumption at the bottom, where every dollar has velocity. SNAP recipients spend benefits immediately, locally, and entirely. Cutting that flow removes oxygen from the most fragile layer of the economy first, while insulating those at the top. This is the opening fracture. When food security becomes uncertain, every other cost becomes unbearable. Groceries stop being a variable expense and start competing directly with rent, utilities, and transportation. Once food loses priority status, the entire household balance sheet destabilizes. When food access fractures, price stops being a statistic and becomes a weapon. Official inflation reports show grocery prices rising 8 to 12% year over year, but that number hides the real damage. What households are experiencing is not inflation in isolation. It is purchasing power collapse, where the same income buys radically less survival. The distinction matters because inflation suggests a cycle. Purchasing power collapse signals structural failure. Grocery inflation hits differently because food has no substitute. You can delay buying clothes. You can postpone repairs. You cannot skip calories indefinitely. When staple items rise first, households lose flexibility immediately. The data shows this clearly. Since the pandemic, cumulative grocery prices are up roughly 25 to 30%, while median wages rose closer to 10 to 15%. That gap compounds every month. The result is not higher spending, it's forced downgrading. This is where the illusion of choice disappears. As prices rise, consumers don't switch brands, they switch categories. Fresh produce gets replaced with starch, protein becomes occasional, variety collapses. When food budgets compress this way, nutrition declines before hunger appears. That is why grocery inflation is more dangerous than headline CPI. It quietly degrades health long before starvation shows up in statistics. The mechanics behind this are not mysterious. Food pricing absorbs shocks from fuel, fertilizer, labor, packaging, insurance, and financing costs simultaneously. Unlike discretionary goods, grocers cannot slow demand to stabilize margins. Instead, price increases cascade directly to consumers. Add shrinkflation, smaller quantities at the same price, and households face a double loss: fewer calories per dollar and fewer dollars per paycheck. Budget math exposes the scale. A grocery basket that cost $250 a few years ago now routinely clears $350 to $400 without any change in consumption. That is not lifestyle inflation. That is a $100 to $150 monthly extraction from household cash flow. For families already allocating 50 to 60% of income to fixed costs, that increase is not absorbable. It forces trade-offs with rent, utilities, and debt payments. This is where the damage moves upward. Grocery inflation does not stay confined to low-income households. Middle-income earners feel it faster because they are often over-leveraged: mortgages, car loans, insurance premiums, locked into obligations set when food was cheaper. When groceries spike, there is no margin left to cut. The pressure migrates instantly into credit use. That shift marks the transition from inflation to collapse. When households begin using revolving credit, deferred payments, or installment plans to buy food, prices stop functioning as signals. They become triggers for debt expansion. Every grocery trip pulls future income into the present, shrinking next month's budget before it begins. This creates a feedback loop. Higher prices force borrowing. Borrowing reduces future purchasing power. Reduced purchasing power increases sensitivity to the next price hike. At the macro level, this undermines the consumer economy. Food spending has near 100% velocity. Every dollar spent circulates immediately. When households redirect income from discretionary sectors into groceries, restaurants, retail, and services contract. When they finance food instead, default risk rises across the system. Inflation doesn't just make life expensive, it destabilizes credit. This is why grocery inflation accelerates collapse faster than housing or energy alone. Food is the first expense that cannot be deferred. The first place purchasing power failure becomes visible, and the first signal that households are no longer managing costs, they are surviving them. Once food absorbs the flexible portion of a household budget, the system exposes its next pressure valve: utilities. Unlike groceries, utilities offer no substitution, no downgrade path, and no meaningful consumer control. Electricity, gas, and water are non-negotiable survival inputs, and their pricing structure guarantees extraction regardless of behavior. This is where households discover a brutal truth: using less no longer means paying less. Across the country, utility rates have risen 15 to 30% in 2 years, with some regions approving cumulative increases exceeding 40%. These hikes are not tied to individual consumption. They are driven by capital recovery, grid upgrades, fuel surcharges, wildfire liability, storm hardening, debt servicing, and guaranteed profit frameworks. Most utilities operate as regulated monopolies, meaning consumers cannot shop for alternatives. The bill arrives whether income rose or not. This destroys a foundational assumption of household budgeting: conservation as a defense mechanism. For decades, families managed rising costs by reducing usage, turning off lights, lowering thermostats, delaying appliance use. That relationship is breaking. Rate-based pricing shifts mean the cost per kilowatt-hour rises faster than consumption falls. Even when usage declines, total bills increase. Efficiency becomes irrelevant when fixed charges and delivery fees dominate the invoice. The numbers explain the shock. In many states, fixed utility charges now account for 35 to 50% of monthly bills before a single unit of energy is consumed. Add fuel surcharges and infrastructure riders, and variable usage becomes a minority component. A household cutting consumption by 10 to 15% may still see bills rise $300 to $400 annually due to rate adjustments alone. This is not mismanagement. It is structural design. Utilities also hit at the worst possible time. Grocery inflation has already drained liquidity. Households enter utility season, summer cooling or winter heating, financially weakened. When bills spike suddenly by $200 to $400 in a single month, there is no buffer left. Savings are already depleted. Credit cards are already active. The result is forced prioritization. Electricity over food, heat over debt payments, survival over solvency. This is where utilities transform from services into financial choke points. Unlike rent, utility non-payment carries immediate penalties. Shutoffs occur faster. Late fees compound quickly. Reconnection costs add insult to injury. A missed utility payment destabilizes everything else: work, food storage, health, housing security. One unpaid bill can cascade into eviction risk, job loss, or medical crisis. At the macro level, utility inflation functions as a silent tax. Energy costs are embedded into every good and service, amplifying pressure throughout the economy. Households pay directly through bills and indirectly through higher food prices, higher rents, and higher insurance premiums. Yet wages do not adjust for energy volatility. The burden concentrates at the bottom and middle, where consumption dominates income use. This marks a critical transition in the collapse sequence. Food inflation removed flexibility. Utility inflation removes agency. Households are no longer choosing how to allocate money, they are reacting to unavoidable demands. When fixed survival costs rise simultaneously, financial planning becomes impossible. Bills stop reflecting behavior and start enforcing compliance. Once utilities consume a full paycheck, housing becomes mathematically fragile. Rent, unlike groceries, cannot be downsized weekly. It sits immovable, waiting for income that has already been spent keeping the lights on. Once utilities absorb entire paychecks, rent stops being a bill and becomes a contradiction. Housing costs are no longer aligned with wages, productivity, or hours worked. They are aligned with asset inflation and investor yield targets. That mismatch is why full-time employment is failing at its most basic function: securing shelter. Nationally, median asking rents are up roughly 35 to 45% since 2019, with many metro areas exceeding 50 to 60% increases. Over the same period, median wage growth landed closer to 12 to 18%. That spread is not a temporary imbalance. It is a structural gap that widens every lease cycle. When rent grows 3 times faster than income, math, not behavior, determines the outcome. Rent is a fixed obligation layered on top of already fixed survival costs. By the time housing is paid, food and utilities have already claimed priority. This reverses the historical budgeting order. Rent used to be the anchor expense, capped at 25 to 30% of income. Today, millions of households are spending 40 to 55%, and in some cases 60% plus, just to remain housed. At that level, no amount of discipline can stabilize finances. The pressure compounds through required add-ons. Rent is no longer a standalone figure. Fees for parking, trash, water, insurance, and amenities add $150 to $300 per month beyond the advertised price. These charges are not optional, not negotiable, and not reflected in wage discussions. Housing inflation hides inside line items, silently expanding the gap between paychecks and obligations. Transportation locks the trap. In most regions, employment requires a vehicle. Average car payments now exceed $700 per month for new vehicles and $550 plus for used, with insurance frequently adding $200 to $300. That places housing and mobility alone near or above $2,000 monthly before groceries, utilities, or healthcare enter the equation. For a worker earning $50,000 annually, that consumes nearly 60% of take-home pay. This is where the illusion of working more collapses. Overtime does not close the gap because rent resets annually while wages lag. Side income does not scale fast enough to offset lease increases. Moving no longer solves the problem because rent growth is national, not local. Housing costs have detached from regional labor markets entirely. The downstream effect is forced lateness. Households are no longer choosing whether to save or spend. They are choosing which bill fails first. Rent payments are delayed to cover utilities. Utilities are delayed to buy food. Credit fills the gap temporarily, but each month begins already compromised. This is not budgeting failure. It is systemic insolvency at the household level. At scale, this destabilizes the workforce itself. High rent suppresses job mobility, locks workers into commuting stress, and increases absenteeism and burnout. Employers experience labor shortages not because people don't want to work, but because work no longer guarantees housing. When shelter becomes incompatible with employment, the labor contract breaks. This is the tipping point where cost of living stops being an economic issue and becomes a social one. Housing insecurity amplifies every other stress: health, debt, family stability, while offering no escape valve. Once rent consumes income, healthcare finishes the conversion from strain to debt. Unlike food, utilities, or housing, healthcare is not optional, negotiable, or delay tolerant. It is enforced by law, priced by private markets, and structured so that coverage does not equal care. This is where survival itself becomes a financial liability. Health insurance in the United States functions less like protection and more like a monthly access fee. Average employer-sponsored premiums now exceed $8,400 per year for individuals and $23,000 for families, with workers covering a growing share. For those outside employer plans, individual premiums commonly range from $400 to $600 per month. Yet that payment does not eliminate costs. It merely unlocks the right to pay more. Deductibles expose the trap. The average deductible for employer plans now exceeds $1,700, while individual market plans frequently carry deductibles between $3,000 and $6,000. Until that threshold is met, nearly all care is paid out of pocket. Even after co-pays and co-insurance remain. The result is an annual healthcare floor of $5,000 to $10,000 per person, regardless of income. That is not insurance against risk. It is guaranteed extraction. This structure collides directly with the housing math already broken. After rent, utilities, food, and transportation, there is no margin left to absorb medical costs. Healthcare expenses do not arrive evenly. They strike in lumps: unexpected visits, prescriptions, tests, forcing households to choose between treatment and solvency. When savings are depleted and credit already stretched, medical bills become debt by default. Medical debt is uniquely dangerous because it escalates without negotiation. Bills unpaid for 30 to 90 days are commonly sold to collections. Once transferred, interest, fees, and legal action enter the picture. While initial medical debt may not immediately impact credit, collections do. Wage garnishment, asset seizure, and court judgments become possible outcomes. Illness turns into a long-term financial sentence. The scale is massive. Americans collectively hold over $220 billion in medical debt, with nearly 1 in 5 adults carrying some form of unpaid balance. This burden is not concentrated among the uninsured. A majority of medical debtors have insurance. Coverage did not prevent the debt. It enabled it by allowing higher-priced systems to operate with limited consumer resistance. Healthcare inflation also compounds upstream pressures. Rising medical costs push insurance premiums higher each year, reducing take-home pay. Employers offset rising benefit expenses by suppressing wages or cutting hours. The same worker squeezed by rent and utilities finds income shrinking again, indirectly, through benefit costs. Healthcare drains households both directly and invisibly. This is where the system becomes irreversible. Food scarcity triggered panic. Utilities removed control. Rent erased flexibility. Healthcare removes exit options. You cannot opt out without legal penalties. You cannot self-insure without wealth. You cannot delay without risk. The only remaining tool is credit, spreading today's survival across tomorrow's income. Once healthcare pushes households into revolving debt, the final illusion collapses. That credit is a bridge. In reality, it is a funnel. Minimum payments lock future cash flow, ensuring the next expense arrives into a weaker financial position. This is how temporary hardship becomes permanent fragility. At this stage, households are no longer managing costs, they are financing existence. And when survival itself requires borrowing, the economy transitions into its most dangerous phase, Widespread dependence on debt not for growth or consumption, but for food, shelter, energy, and care. When healthcare converts income gaps into permanent debt, credit stops being optional and becomes the operating system of daily life. What once financed homes or education is now being used to finance calories. This is the moment an economy crosses from stress into breakdown, when survival itself is placed on a payment plan. Roughly 25% of American adults now use buy now, pay later or revolving credit to purchase groceries. This is not discretionary spending. These platforms are being used for milk, eggs, bread, rice, and pasta. The mechanics are deceptively simple. Split a $150 to $300 grocery bill into 4 payments, defer the pain, survive the week. But the consequences are cumulative and severe. BNPL and short-term credit shift costs forward without increasing income. Fees, penalties, and interest routinely push the real cost of groceries 10 to 30% higher than the shelf price. That means a household paying $1,000 a month for food may actually be committing $1,200 to $1,300 of future income just to eat. The next month begins already depleted before a single bill arrives. This accelerates a dangerous feedback loop. Grocery credit reduces immediate cash strain, but it shrinks the next paycheck. Reduced next month liquidity increases dependence on credit again. Each cycle narrows financial breathing room. What begins as temporary relief quickly becomes structural reliance. The household is no longer budgeting, it is rolling debt forward to stay alive. The scale matters because food spending has no elasticity. Unlike entertainment or travel, groceries cannot be paused to recover cash flow. When financed food collides with fixed obligations, rent, utilities, insurance, the system forces prioritization through delinquency. Missed payments are not signs of irresponsibility. They are the mathematical outcome of debt-financed survival. Credit data already reflects this shift. Delinquencies on short-term consumer credit are rising faster than traditional loans. Average credit card APRs now exceed 21 to 24%, meaning grocery purchases carried for a year can double in cost. What was once a nutrition expense becomes a long-tail liability, draining income long after the food is gone. At the macro level, this undermines consumer stability. An economy built on consumption assumes households have disposable income. Financing necessities eliminates that foundation. When groceries are bought on credit, discretionary spending collapses next. Retail, services, and local businesses feel the contraction not because demand vanished, but because it was pulled forward and exhausted. This marks a critical escalation in the collapse sequence. Food insecurity began with access, intensified through prices, and now mutates into debt dependency. Credit masks the crisis temporarily, smoothing visible distress, but it deepens fragility underneath. Each month of finance survival increases default risk across the system. When credit reaches its limit, behavior changes, not gradually, physically. The crisis leaves spreadsheets and enters geography. Survival shifts from budgeting decisions to spatial decisions: where to sleep, where to work, where heat is cheapest. This is not homelessness as traditionally defined, it is economic displacement inside employment. Housing, utilities, and financed food have already exhausted income. What remains is adaptation. People reduce square footage not by downsizing apartments, but by abandoning them. Vehicles become multi-use assets: transportation, shelter, workspace, and heating unit. This is not preference. It is cost optimization under pressure. Gasoline at $3 to $4 per gallon becomes cheaper than electricity bills exceeding $300 to $500 per month. The math is crude but unavoidable. The logic is transactional. Heating a car for hours costs a fraction of heating a home with inflated utility rates. Internet access migrates to mobile hotspots. Work moves to parking lots because climate control is cheaper there than indoors. The system forces people to arbitrage survival costs across environments. This is not innovation. It is system failure being managed at the individual level. These adaptations signal a deeper breakdown, the collapse of the home as an economic anchor. A functioning economy assumes housing supports productivity, rest, stability, preparation. When people must choose between shelter and solvency, housing stops performing its role. Productivity doesn't disappear, but it relocates into improvised spaces designed for endurance, not sustainability. The scale of this shift is growing. Vehicle residency is rising alongside rent burdens, especially among employed adults. Surveys show increasing numbers of workers spending nights in cars while maintaining full-time jobs. This is not captured in unemployment data. It doesn't appear in housing starts, but it reflects a labor force being priced out of the infrastructure required to function normally. This adaptation also accelerates social fragmentation. Living and working in transient spaces removes access to community, healthcare continuity, and civic engagement. It increases exposure to policing, fines, and displacement. Survival becomes mobile, temporary, and invisible. The economy continues on paper while human stability erodes underneath. Adaptation buys time, but it extracts dignity and health. It is the last stage before abandonment. Once living arrangements become incompatible with long-term work, people stop optimizing within the system and begin exiting parts of it. Assets become liabilities. Commitments are reevaluated, and eventually, individuals make a rational decision that would have been unthinkable earlier, letting go of ownership entirely. When adaptation fails, surrender begins. This is the final behavioral shift in an economic collapse. Not protest, not panic, but withdrawal. People stop trying to keep the life they were sold and start dismantling it piece by piece. Assets that once symbolized stability become threats to survival. Ownership itself turns toxic. The first signal is demand destruction. Cars, once essential for work and mobility, become recurring liabilities. Monthly payments exceeding $600 to $800, insurance above $200, fuel, maintenance, and registration push total ownership costs past $1,000 per month. In a system where rent, utilities, food, and healthcare already exceed income, that number is unsustainable. The rational response is not default, it is exit. This matters because asset surrender is different from delinquency. Default implies delay and recovery. Surrender implies finality. When people voluntarily abandon financed assets, they are not waiting for relief. They are acknowledging that future income will not improve enough to support past obligations. That belief change marks the true beginning of recession at the household level. At scale, this behavior rewires the economy. Reduced car ownership lowers fuel demand, insurance revenue, maintenance spending, and retail mobility. Housing demand softens as people compress living arrangements. Credit growth stalls as borrowers self-select out. These are not cyclical adjustments. They are structural contractions triggered by survival math, not sentiment. The data already reflects this shift. Auto delinquencies are climbing, especially among subprime and near-prime borrowers. Used vehicle prices, once inflated by scarcity, are falling as supply rises from forced and voluntary exits. Lenders tighten terms, raising rates further, and accelerating the feedback loop. Each surrender today removes demand tomorrow. This is how recession truly forms, not through headlines or GDP prints, but through mass participation withdrawal. Traditional recessions follow layoffs. This one follows cost overload. Employment remains nominally intact while consumption collapses underneath it. Workers still clock in, but they stop buying, upgrading, traveling, and committing. The economy hollows out from the inside. The most dangerous aspect is psychological. Surrender is contagious. When people see others walking away from obligations without catastrophic consequence, the social contract weakens. The promise that effort guarantees stability dissolves. Once that belief breaks, recovery becomes exponentially harder because confidence, not capital, is gone. This is why the term recession fails to capture what's happening. Recessions imply cycles and rebounds. What is unfolding is a structural retreat from ownership, debt, and participation. A system designed around perpetual consumption cannot survive when survival itself requires disengagement. The endgame is not collapse by explosion, but collapse by erosion. And when millions quietly step back at once, the economy doesn't crash. It disappears.